All right. Okay. We'll just wait for these people to come and then start.
Hello, everyone. If everyone could start taking their seats, we'll try to get started soon. Thank you, everyone, for coming today on this beautiful fall day. On this beautiful late summer day. Still hanging on to those last few days of summer. Thank you so much for coming today. I see we have a mix of people, not just from St. James, but some new faces. So I'm Megan Corbett. I am the chair of the Green Team here at St. James. This is our second educational series talk that we have, event going on here at St. James. And we're super happy to welcome everyone here today. Today we have our Green Burials talk with Sue and David Lyon. So it'll start with a presentation from them, and it'll be followed by a Q&A. And thank you to those who are joining us on live stream as well today. The chat will be open, so you can send any Q&A questions, and we'll get those up as well. And then after that, we'll have an informal discussion in the parish hall, which is just through those doors and up the stairs with some refreshments as well. For those of you who aren't used to St. James, if you need the bathroom, it's just through these doors here. And so our presenters here we have today are David and Sue Lyon. Both are well known to the St. James community and were for many years involved in the music leadership at the Wednesday morning service. Sue is an accomplished potter, an elder at the Next Church, and the person who's responsible for having Green Burials here in Kingston, a group that has been working to advocate natural burial in our city. David is a retired professor from Queen's. A sociologist, he also founded and headed the university's Center for Surveillance Studies. He has also been involved in the Kingston Green Burial Group from its beginning. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to David and Sue if we would like to welcome them here today.
I don't know where you're going to stand, that's all.
I'm going to stand right here.
Okay. As
that
long as
good?
everybody can see the screen, that's fine.
Yep. So, yeah, thanks for the welcome. We're happy.
Well, that's up to the person at the back.
I have the mic on. Can you not hear? Okay, fine. So, yeah, very happy to be here. Thanks for your welcome. And we're going to run through the slideshow. So if you can't see the screen, you might want to come closer. Think outside the box. So it's sometimes suggested that somehow green burial is a kind of new thing. And certainly when we started when Sue started the green burial group in Kingston, we were thinking in terms of climate change and coming to this and talking with the city about it under the Climate Action Plan. And that is how we got our entry into the working with the city in the first place, for better or worse. And so think outside the box. Is this something new that has to do with climate change? Answer, no. If you think back maybe to the middle of the 19th century, and here you are at St. James. There's a family here at St. James they were here fairly soon after St. James was founded, in the 1850s, the Comer family. No, they didn't. They built a house, Maple View, and it's just down Division Street. You can see it for yourself. It's a student house now, of course. But then it was their home. Now, when someone died in their household, what would they have done, let's say in the 1860s? They would have kept the body in their home, and they would have gone down Princess Street to 240, where James Reed furniture and caskets hung out. And they would have asked about a casket, and they would have bought a simple casket, and James Reed would have taken it on their little wagon, pulled by the horse, round to Maple View on Division Street. And they would have left the casket there. If they needed help in the home to put the body into the casket, they would have helped, but basically they were delivering the casket. And nothing had been done to the body except to wash it and prepare it for burial. And so there it sat, and if there were relatives or friends who wanted to see, they could come and see. And after that, it would be taken off to be buried. It could still have been in the lower burial ground, which is where St. Paul's Anglican Church stands, or more likely, it would have gone straight along Barry Street to the cemetery, which was the Upper Cemetery in Kingston. And there it would have been buried. Sue and I live right by the Upper Burial Ground, which is now known as Skeleton Park, for the obvious reason that what is now Alma Street used to be Cemetery Lane, and that is where many, many people were buried. So, think outside the box. You don't have to think about futuristic green burial. We're simply returning to tradition. This is traditionalism that we're introducing to you this afternoon. Okay, next slide.
So it says here, green burial's a natural and traditional way of caring for our dead. And we're encouraging everybody that we meet, if we can, to have frank conversations about death and how we can change that culture of silence that has grown up around death and about making our own plans for what we want and thinking about our options. So I wonder how many of you have talked about death with your family, with your best friends, with anybody that you will be important at the time. So yeah, so think about that. And there are lots of options these days for attending like a death cafe or other ways in which you could start to talk. And we as a society need to talk about it. And we need to say that it's death and not that it's just necessarily past. So there's just a few thoughts about that. Next slide, please.
So Green Burial Kingston formed in 2017. Sue and a friend had been talking about green burial for some time, and they decided that it was a good plan to start a group. And then the friend went off to South Korea for a number of years, and Sue was left holding the file. And so Sue became the convener of Green Burial Kingston. So we started then, and there are now more than 170 members in the city. And I mean, that's just people who have paid to help keep the funds up in order for us to be able to advertise and do little bits of printing and that sort of thing. And there's a small core group of us, 9 people, who work together as the working group just to keep the show on the road. And we have 3 tasks, and you can see this on the website. Advocacy, obviously, we're advocating for green burial because we believe in it and because we think it's really important. Secondly, it's to do with sharing information and education, and we are constantly educating ourselves, working with the Natural Burial Association of Ontario, for example, Natural Burial Association of Ontario, and they are the ones that are overseeing initiatives like ours right across the province. So we work with them, and we're learning all the time about green burial and the possibilities, and also site prospecting. In other words, looking for suitable sites for green burial in and around Kingston. When we first started, we did a complete inventory of all the cemeteries that are in the within the city limits.
And north. We had
And
South
north of that,
Frontenac as well, and so we did look wider than just that.
So we were trying to work out where might be possible. Anyway, we'll come on to what we discovered, but next slide, please.
So you might not know, and you might know, what is a natural burial. Now you can use the words natural or green, and we have often moved a little bit more towards natural because green, there's a lot of greenwashing today, and a lot of things claiming to be green that aren't necessarily fully green. But we established Green Burial Kingston, so we're not changing our name, but natural burial. You'll see the 2 words. So green burial is a natural way of caring for our dead and has been practiced for most of human history. So what does that mean today? Well, it means that the body is going to be buried in a simple, biodegradable casket or under a shroud and in a protected green space. That's our, what we're looking for. And then decomposition of the body contributes to the Earth's renewal, while above ground there aren't, big headstones for everything and mowed lawns. So not like a traditional cemetery, but instead you could have native flowers, grasses, trees, creating a vibrant ecosystem and restoring and protecting nature. Also, typically, green burials also encourage and enable direct family involvement. And a lot of the research has shown that that is very significant in the grieving process. If you can contribute some way and not just ignore it and hope that you're going to feel better in a few months, you can actually be part of saying goodbye. It really helps in the grieving. Next, please.
And on that point, Sue actually was working with the local death care group at the same time as getting into green burial. I don't know which came first, really, but you...
The death care group
you were
was first.
in the death care group, and really we think of them as belonging together, death care with green burial. And so family and friends get involved, and there are some pictures there of, well, it's a bit hard to see, isn't it? But there's children by a little mound that they're obviously visiting an already buried person. There are folks burying their friend, family and friends, burying their friend who has just had a shroud around her or him. And there is a sort of pre-decorated, on the left-hand side at the bottom, there's a pre-decorated burial spot. And we'll talk a little bit about the importance of biodegradable matter, green matter in the grave.
And also it can not just look like an empty hole. You could put flowers and cedar boughs and things in there first, then for the coffin or the shroud to rest on that first of all.
I don't know if you saw the little video that was advertising for this afternoon, but there's a personal statement in that you might be interested in. It's called Over My Dead Body.
It was a poem that David wrote.
Under my dead body, fragrant cedar is stored. With soil at the ready, lower me on a board. Let my children and theirs join friends' songs as they spade. Add soil, poems, and prayers, mound memories above grade. Over my dead body, a decorated shroud, plus some loose dirt on top, branch and leaf piling proud. Air and water stand by, prompting decomposition. Earth to earth I return for soil's restoration. Let family imagine thoughtful details they choose. This event is for others. I have nothing to lose. Just thank the Creator for life's meaningful span, for hope of renewed earth and a free and fair land. So I've shared that with my children and grandchildren, so they know what to do. They know what grandpa or their father wants, and as I say, the details are up to them, because the actual event is not my event, it's their event. And as Sue says, it's part of the grieving process to participate. And we know lots of wonderful stories about how families and friends have participated in such events. So, family and friends, get involved.
Next, please. So, we're here as part of the Creation Care series, or the Green Group here. And so, a basic human responsibility given to us is to care for God's earth. And, you know, you think you can do that, and hopefully many of us are doing that in our lifetimes. And all sorts of ways that we could be caring for the earth, but that doesn't have to stop when you die. And you could continue that restorative practice by the way that you choose to be buried. And then it also says family and friends can participate fully, creating their own ceremony and bringing songs and prayers and sharing in the burial tasks should they want to. So you know how you sprinkle a tiny bit of soil? That pile of soil that's waiting, which is exactly the soil that was taken out and usually put back in the right order so that it's better for the earth. And there can even be small shovels for grandchildren or anybody else that wants to help fill that in. And that process too is very therapeutic.
Notice on the slide that the grave doesn't look very much like contemporary ones where the earth is tamped down after the event. The whole point is decomposition, and you're going to speed that up by having lots of air in there, lots of vegetable matter of all kinds right in. And so you see that this one was in Lincolnshire in the UK, so when I visited it last year, and the mounds are really quite high, just because the earth is so loosely scattered, and there's various leaf and branch matter in there too. So that explains why they look rather different from conventional.
But they'll drop by themselves.
Oh yeah, they drop over
time. You don't need to tamp it at all. It'll just end up down at the level of the earth. Okay? And we'll talk about in just 1 minute with the next slide. Okay? And there is this, this slide is actually on a card in the other room, so if you go through afterwards and want to look at it more closely. So here, this is a contrast between the conventional burial and the natural burial. So often in a conventional graveyard, you would see lots of stones. And sometimes floral arrangements, could be of any kind, non-native, or even artificial flowers on the grave.
And if that's conventional, then the green one would be, well, it can be all kinds of things. But the main idea is to have some kind of communal memorial so that people can see clearly that so-and-so was buried here, and that is important to people if they want to come and visit, but not large engraved stones that then need an awful lot of upkeep over the years. The park where we live, Skeleton Park, became such a mess in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. In the end, they closed it because it was just getting completely out of hand. And the reason in that case was that so many of the people who had been buried there were victims of typhus and cholera from the epidemics that occurred in the 1830s and early 1840s. And frankly, there was no one left to look after those gravestones. But it happens anyway, because people are much more mobile these days. There aren't folks around to look after those stones. So you're doing everyone a favor in not having a heavy stone marking the grave. And so for green burial, in any case, by law, where the body lies has to be known. So there is always a GPS marker for a body in the ground. And then after that, there are lots of possibilities. We've seen green burial places where there's a big board right in the corner or near the entrance to the cemetery, and everyone is listed on there. Sometimes there's a map showing you where the different sections are. There's a map, for example, at Royal Oak in Victoria, which is a hybrid cemetery, both conventional and natural burial. And there, the people names are marked in a very clear way, and so it goes. I mean, there are just lots of possibilities.
And if you're thinking about visiting the actual grave, if you had been at the funeral or if you hadn't, how nice would it be to walk in the woods or in a lovely meadow of wildflowers and know this is where your loved one was buried. So the next thing is that in a conventional cemetery, there's usually highly manicured lawns that have to be mowed and have to cost a lot of upkeep. They're often using fertilizers, pesticides, and other such to keep it looking, you know, like we see a lot of cemeteries. Whereas
in green burial, you'll have a meadow or a woodland. Basically, those are your choices. So the meadow is like a field, and encouraging indigenous plants to grow in that meadow. Or in the woodland, you're just trying to maintain, again, indigenous trees. And we can talk about woodland or meadow as we go along. But the idea is minimal maintenance and maximal pollination, maximum natural places.
Because some of those we're going to talk about a bit more later on. So you can see in that conventional one, the casket can be made of metal, hardwood, plastic, even bronze, I think they have, all sorts of things, and and sometimes surrounded by a concrete vault. And often you might feel, well, I have to spend more money, I have to get the very best, so they'll know how much I loved them. But actually, that needs to be said and shown during their lifetime. And then, when they have died, you don't need to buy all of those things and go along with those things. So, so that's why we don't think about those things. And instead, we're just going to have the casket made of biodegradable materials. A simple pine box, could be a cardboard box. You can decorate it how you want to, if you want to add decoration to it. It could just be a board, because you tend to need a board to put the body on and the shroud on, so that it's easier to lower it down, or even a wicker basket, something like that. So something that's biodegradable is what we want in natural burial. And then there's the point about the body being embalmed, and that is a process, and the poor people that have to do it, really, some of them have suffered quite badly, different illnesses, but all your body fluids are drained away and you're filled instead with formaldehyde, and then all the best makeup and things to make you look wonderful. I mean, that's what happens. And sometimes if you've planned your funeral already, that might be done as an automatic thing, but it is not a legal requirement. It's not necessary. You can choose just to stay natural, and even if you want home visitation, as long as the body is kept cool, then you can still visit. Say you've got relatives coming in from out of town and they want to actually see the body, that can be arranged, and you can be on ice for, it lasts for quite a long time. There are some complications sometimes that make that difficult, but that's the way it goes. So, yeah, so no embalming is another thing. And also then, Dawn, you asked about the depth. So you can see in the conventional one, we generally talk about 6 feet under, and that wasn't always the case either. But that was when they began to think that a dead body could spread the disease that it had. And actually, there's extremely few diseases that can be passed on after death. And I think, is it Ebola? There's
something like that.
Something like Ebola or something like that, but very few. So mostly you cannot catch diseases from the dead body. And so it doesn't need to go 6 feet down, and by law in this country, it doesn't have to be 6 feet down. The top of whatever you're buried in has to be, it's only about 2 feet below the surface of the earth. And so there's no need to dig all that way down, and if you dig that far down, you're not going to have all the microorganisms that are nearer to the surface to help with the decomposition and for that pile to go down. So let's have the next slide, please. Oh, it's supposed to be me again. Okay.
Go for it.
So cremation. Okay. Now, today, at least 70% of Ontarians opt, and in Kingston it's a little higher than that, opt for cremation. And we understand why, because there's all sorts of reasons why you might choose cremation. Sometimes it feels like a good thing to say, well, I'd like some of my ashes over here, I'd like some to be taken back to Scotland, I'd like to throw them off a mountain up there, and so you can see why that might be an attractive thing to do. Some people are concerned about ground use and say, oh, we haven't got enough room for more graveyards. And one of the things about a natural burial graveyard is you're preserving a green space. You're preserving that woodland. It cannot be built on. And so that's another advantage there. And also, you think it might be eco-friendly, but you've got to think about the fuel that's used in order to burn the body. Did you know the fuel required fills an SUV tank twice? And the amount of carbon dioxide that's released into the atmosphere during that burning process. There can be other things released into the atmosphere too, different chemicals, although some crematoriums have a filter, which is really good, and that is going to be taking away the things that, the metals that could be released into the atmosphere. Yeah, okay, so next slide, please.
Okay, so you're gathering that these are the principles that are behind green or natural burial. So it's an earth burial. There's no embalming. The point of it is ecological restoration and conservation. Memorials are communal. We optimize land use. And it may well be that as time goes on, other principles are added to it, and one that is possible is grave renewal. There is no reason, if a body has been decomposing at a good rate, why somebody else shouldn't use the same grave 30 years later on. It's unlikely there's going to be a lot left. It depends on the soil types. It depends on the body type, actually. There are all sorts of reasons why that length of time might differ, but there's no reason why that grave shouldn't be used again by someone else later on. As I say, the whole point, or as we're saying, the whole point, decomposition, and then the grave is freed up. There are other countries that already have grave renewal. Netherlands is one.
For sure. Mm-hmm.
And there are several others that already practice grave renewal, and it makes a lot of sense. A lot of people, I think, when they're thinking about cremation, think, oh, well, there's not enough land left for burial. Well, if we buried in a green way, then there would be a renewal of possibilities in the same place.
And also when they come to the grave after the time limit of how long it's going to be, then bones will still be there. Bones take a lot longer, and so then the bones could be left below the next burial. They could just be at the bottom there. And also if you have, like me, hip joints and things that are metal, they can then be taken out and recycled at that point. So that's any metal parts that are in there could be recycled. Okay, next, please. Oh, okay. We can try that one. I think we've said most of that. Let's go to this standalone or hybrid, because we've been talking about a hybrid cemetery. So hybrid cemetery is a cemetery where there's a conventional cemetery and then there's an area that's been designated for natural burials. And they're not all mixed in, so there isn't just one in the middle of everything else, but maybe a little gateway through or something like that. Whereas a standalone one is a place in which the whole cemetery is dedicated only to natural burials. And that, as I said, could be a lovely woodland or a field or something like that. And many other countries are far more advanced in establishing the standalone ones than Canada is. In fact, and so there are only 2, I think, in our country. There might be some more in Quebec. It's hard to get the information about that, but certainly out to the west of us, and including Ontario, there is no standalone cemetery, natural burial cemetery. And so, they're so unusual, could we have one in Kingston? We would love that. We're going to keep on working to see if that's what we could get. Next, please.
So yeah, natural burial is gaining ground, and if you go to the UK, you will find 300 plus standalone green burial sites, and in the US, 240 or so. The UK was well ahead, and in the US, this has been growing very fast. The Green Burial Society in the US, if you're looking for another website to check things out on, they have some wonderful information and visuals on their website. So 240 plus in the US. In Canada, there are 2 tiny standalone cemeteries, each on a Gulf island, one on Denman and the other on Salt Spring. So if you really want to go a long way for your remains to be buried, then those are the places to go if you're looking for standalone. But most of what we have in Canada already is hybrid. So you have green burial being introduced into a conventional cemetery. We have 9 in Ontario, and the closest used to be Union Cemetery in Cobourg, and a good friend of ours, just because there was nothing closer, took her husband's body by car, in her car, to Cobourg for a burial that was really rather lovely with family and friends. They had some guitars there, and they were singing songs for Ed as he was laid in the ground. So that used to be the nearest. Now it is in Picton at Glenwood. And if you're ever in Picton, you might like just to go to Glenwood because it is truly beautiful. It's a woodland burial area within a conventional cemetery. It was one that somebody donated land right in the city in Picton. And again, you can look at the memorials. The way that people are memorialized there is very neat. I won't go into the details, but Glenwood is a beautiful green burial area. Are they still the closest? Well,
that's the question. So the next slide, please. So we have been working with the city when we discovered, we checked with all the cemeteries and asked them, are you willing to set aside an area for green burial? And we kept feeling quite disappointed that the answer wasn't positive at all. And then we found out that the city of Kingston had responsibility for an old church, cemetery out on Brewers Mills Road. So it's out up in what was the old Pittsburgh Township, okay? And that's just a very small 2-acre cemetery, but they had responsibility for it, and so we kept pressing them to say, you know, climate leadership, action plan, Kingston, a sustainable city, come on guys, where could we have a natural burial? And they've been working with us over a few years now. Well, it says 20, oh, that's when it, yeah. We were talking to them before 2022, and they've now got to the point where they have to publish, they're not actually publicly posting what the bylaws are, but they've posted a notice saying they're changing the bylaws for Pine Grove Cemetery. You can see a notice on the edge of Skeleton Park. There will be one out at Pine Grove as well, and it also has been in the newspaper, and they have to publicly post that for 4 weeks. We must be almost at the end of the 4 weeks. I can't quite remember when it started. And then they'll submit those to the BAO, which is the Bereavement Authority of Ontario, who give the final approval and stamp. And so when they do that, and we also worked with them, they started off, you can come in if you like, we started off by saying they allocated 33 spots. They were rather mixed in with the conventional graves, so like a row of conventional, a row of natural. a car park, yeah. And so we felt a bit disappointed. And then when we brought Mark Richardson from Niagara, who is the cemetery director for the city of Niagara Falls and runs a green burial hybrid there, he said, oh, well, on the other side of this path, there's all this space along here. Why don't you add 50 more graves? And that could be just a meadow. You wouldn't be trying to mow this bit and not that bit. And so they added another 50 spots. And so there should be 83 spots available at Pine Grove Cemetery as soon as it's had the BAO approval. So if you are interested in being told when those are open, then you should call Derek O'Shea, and there's his address, okay, and phone number. And also, when they presented it to council in July, they also made a proposition that council direct $50,000 to appoint a cemetery director. Well, you can imagine this little old cemetery, which had maybe one burial a year, maybe not having had one for a few years, didn't really need anybody to do anything. The city just notified the guy to go and dig it, and that was it. But if they're going to have 83 plots, they need somebody to manage that and to help direct people who want a natural burial. And of course, you can still employ your funeral director, and they can also help, okay? So we think, and then also this little plot, this little cemetery is surrounded by 32 acres of woodland, and we are hoping that the owners of that woodland, David and I have talked to them, would actually sell a piece of that woodland to extend the cemetery into a woodland burial lot. So,
and the city has agreed to investigate it. So
to investigate. They haven't done anything yet.
The city is investigating the possibilities of getting the surrounding woodland. If we had 5 acres in there, we could have a great woodland burial area. And we're quite excited about the prospect because although it takes forever working with the city, it looks like it could happen. I believe it will happen, personally.
Right, okay.
We shall see.
Next slide, please.
Oh, yeah. You might have seen my son Tim on the streets around here. He is the owner of Main Street Market and does deliveries from his urban farm by bicycle. And he's already told me that he plans to take me up to Pine Grove for some final rites. And he wants to take me on his bicycle. He's upgraded now. He's almost 50, and he's upgraded to electrical, assistance.
Power assistance.
So he thinks that he's going to be taking me, and so there is somebody else being taken, but there's also someone who's managed to get a horse-drawn cart to take someone to their final resting place. So,
or electric or hybrid vehicle.
Yeah.
Maybe other people going by bicycle or even a bus rather than lots of cars to go there. All sorts of ideas. Okay.
Just keep it green.
Next, please. Do you want to say? Yeah, so these are some pictures of different places where they have standalone cemeteries in different places around, and that's the Salt Spring Island one up at the top on the left. It said it's the only public standalone site because the other one is only available for residents of that island. But that one is a public one. 13 acres of Douglas fir ecosystem behind a thriving farm. And Kingston could still boast the first standalone cemetery in Ontario because there are about 15 groups in Ontario all trying to establish a natural burial cemetery. But there are various hurdles. I don't want to go into it for too much, but one of them is that the BAO raised the price that you have to put into the trust fund up to $165,000 So you've got to raise that much money before you could get permission to start a new cemetery. But working with the city, once somebody runs a cemetery and has responsibility for that, they can add more cemeteries under that umbrella. And same's true for South Frontenac. They can add new cemeteries if they're willing to do that. So even those woodlands could be actually separate because they have a separate entrance, could be a standalone. If it's already a cemetery, it's already got its trust fund. So actually they don't ask for more, but I don't know if you know this, but 40% of every grave plot that is bought goes naturally into the trust fund. So I just want to say that that 165,000 is higher than any other province. Some provinces don't require anything, and the other highest one is 25,000. Good question. And then the other thing is for the 40% of the plot, again, that varies, and that's for maintenance. So how much maintenance is needed for a natural burial ground? So, you know, anyway, we're almost at the end here. If you want to think about whether you have some land and what we need in order to start a new standalone place, next slide, please. Perhaps you can read some of that yourself, so I don't need to go through it all, and we can also tell you more about that later. Okay? So that's what we need, and then if you go to the next one, please. Next slide. And also, the wonderful thing about natural burials are that that site could be used for all sorts of things, because it's just a beautiful site. It can just be a meadow. You could have a place where you can have beehives, butterfly pollinators, school groups coming to visit the place if it's big enough and it's got all sorts of possibilities there. Picnics, hiking trails, cross-country skiing, learning centers, conservation work. You could even have a gathering place, if you have a gathering place for people for the funeral. It could also be used for weddings. I mean, it's a beautiful place. It's not just a cemetery. So all sorts of possibilities in the burial ground.
And if you walk through the Pine Grove woodland just behind the cemetery, Sue and I have already prospected for the area where we would like to see the little event venue. There's a clearing in the forest, and it's just a beautiful place. It would be a great place for weddings and all kinds of family events. So the possibilities for opening up the burial area for all kinds of uses is, we think, a very exciting one.
Yeah, okay, next slide, please. So, there you go. Thank you very much for your time and for your interest. And you might have some questions. I think Megan's no, not Megan. I think you were going to repeat the questions or come to the mic. And also, please consider becoming a member of Green Burial Kingston, because that makes a difference when we're saying to the city, look, we've got this many members that want this, come on. And more members. We also just have a newsletter if that's all you want to do, and we can say we've got hundreds more taking our newsletter. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just up here to remind people, if they do have questions, it would be better to use the mic here because we are online and we want everybody to be able to hear the questions, including the people who aren't here in person.
So if anybody has questions, please come and ask them. We'll see what we can do.
This is a question from Jim, who had to leave, which was, he was wondering how conventional funeral industry is looking at this possibility of more green burial, more natural burial, and is there conflict with kind of inching into their revenue streams? And what's your experience so far in working with the conventional funeral industry?
Okay, I think that there is conflict because they're out for their business, and so they're going to be concerned that they're losing some business, right? We're not trying to be confrontational in any sense, but then some funeral directors have already started to work with natural burial, and so I'm not meaning to advertise one in particular, but we do work with James Reed, and they are very willing to offer transportation for the body, to also break down what their costs are so that you can see quite clearly what you are actually paying for and choose what you want rather than being given this whole package. And they also sell biodegradable coffins and shrouds, and so they're willing to adjust a little, and there always will be a small demand for conventional. And also it's tricky because you've got the cemetery directors and you've got the funeral industry, because the cemetery directors have to try to make enough money to maintain these high maintenance cemeteries. So they're not being mean, they're trying to be able to keep it going, and some of them, if their trust funds run out, then actually, technically, the city has to take them over, which is what has happened in South Frontenac. That's why South Frontenac County actually runs lots of small cemeteries that were there.
But it's true, we have discovered that the political economy of burial is pretty complex, and it's certainly true that the old established family firm, as is so often the case, is going to be a preferable place to go than to one of the large conglomerate chains of cemetery operators. And also the large conglomerates tend to not be upfront with the actual costs, and you have to persuade them to give you a breakdown. We went to one which we won't name, but we discovered by questioning that it costs something like $500 just to cross the cemetery, just to get
to take the body from where it was resting in their resting place to take it to the graveside. Additional $500
and
in a hearse.
Yeah, the way that the costs rise is extremely rapid, and yeah, so you are always better off with small family firms in my estimation. But yeah, there's so many complexities. So when you start to get into this, it is, yeah, it's a really good question anyway that we have to confront.
Okay, Dawn.
Just practically, I was very excited to hear about Pine Grove and when you said it was set near Brewers Mills, because I fish up at Brewers Mills, and I'm guessing that Pine Grove is a road to the east off 15, a little sign Pine Grove, and if I took it, I would find...
If you go along there and then turn left on Church Lane, and then the cemetery's up in that top corner, or if you go Brewers Mills, it's off Brewers Mills Road.
Cool, thanks so much.
Yeah, it's a mixture of rolling farmland and woodland.
She said she fishes there, so she's
yeah,
good.
but it's a beautiful place.
Thank you for your presentation. My questions are kind of process-oriented. When you showed the elevated mounds in the UK, what steps do they take to discourage scavenging, like scavenging by animals? That was one question. And the other one is, in the woodland setting, how do they get around tree roots to do the burials?
Yeah, so you have somebody like at the one in Glenwood, they know where to place the graves. And if you dig and then there's a tree root going across, it's possible for you to lift that tree root and then to put it back, depending on how major a tree root it is. You know,
They work with arborists.
yeah,
there.
they know how to do that. So that's one. And the other was the
About scavenging.
scavenging, yeah.
Like with the shallower burials.
Yeah, okay. You still, even with that mound, you still have to be 2 feet below the surface, not below the mound. So you're still that far down. There's no evidence that any animal would want to dig that far down for something down there, you know. I don't know if you've had if you have a dog, if you've seen how far down a dog might dig for a bone.
I've probably read too many murder mysteries with
Yeah.
bodies in the woods.
Yeah, no, so, and I don't know if they're properly buried, those bodies in the woods, or whether they were, you know, just where they dropped.
It's a common concern, but really, if we found evidence, or if any of the experts who work in the area had evidence, we would tell you about it, but there isn't any.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you again for your presentation. So I was thinking kind of about the spiritual aspect of doing green burials, like for your spiritual life, and particularly in the Christian faith, you know, being stewards of the earth and returning to God's creation. Do you work with other religious groups as well? Have you found kind of connection and harmonization between other spiritual groups or religious groups, or is there a disconnect if they have different practices? They might need to be buried with something it's harder to do green burials, or any connection to other maybe indigenous people? I don't know.
Yeah, great question. And actually, there was a slide where we mentioned Jewish and Muslim burial practices. And quite honestly, they are ahead of Christians, because it's required that you are buried by both Islam and Judaism, and it's required that you do not cremate in both religions. So, where are we, Christian folks? We could think about the reasons that apply in both cases, which is that decomposition and returning to the earth from which we came are the principles that are right there in those religious groups. We don't normally get to speak with actually in church contexts, so it's interesting to have that opportunity right here this afternoon. But yeah, in both of the two other major Abrahamic religions, burial,
Yeah.
conservation, and no cremation, and indeed no embalming.
Yeah, and I don't know how true this is of all Jewish groups, and also you could equally be a non-practicing Jew, so you might not choose this, but I did a course on green burial. It was called a masterclass, and the leader of that was a Jewish woman, and she talked about how they recognize that everybody is equal, so everybody needs to be equal in death, and so everybody should just have a plain pine box. Nobody deserves something more, so that was one thing. And also she mentioned that sometimes in their caskets they have holes in the caskets to allow airflow into the casket for decomposition. So I can't say that that's true of every single Jewish group, you know, but that's it.
And Megan, indigenous groups have quite a wide variety of different sorts of practices, frequently in Canada to do with the kind of terrain. So, I mean, our indigenous groups are in many different kinds of terrains, and you can't generalize about the practices, but you can generalize that by and large they're highly likely to be as green as possible. assuming there is even green where some of our indigenous people live. But yeah, they vary a lot, but there are certainly ways in which they can be dovetailed with the sorts of concerns that we have around green burial.
Yes?
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I am tempted to say at this point that I think you might be slighting Christianity and supporting the funeral business, because if you go back, you really need to add Christianity to Muslim and Jewish practices. Until 1600, there were no cemeteries. You were buried in a church graveyard. And if you could afford to be buried in the church, good for you. But otherwise, you were out in the graveyard. They lined the graves up one at a time. When they got to the end of the graveyard, they went back and started again. And if there were bits of bones and things found, they'd be thrown off to one side. To some extent, what we're saying here is that should be the practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's the funeral business in the 19th century that changed the whole attitude into grandiose funerals and things. So, you know, I would hope that you should have no trouble in talking to probably any religious group in getting back to a natural burial.
Yeah.
Yeah, we hope so. And we're certainly not trying to promote or support the funeral industry, but neither do we want to just be straightforwardly confrontational. There could be a funeral director here, and then, you know, we have had such things in our public meetings and had a funeral director being very offended by what we said. So,
Yeah. And the point about particular moments in history that have led to changes, it was after the American Civil War that embalming became fashionable. And that had everything to do with bringing the bodies of soldiers back from distant places to their home. And they believed that they needed to be embalmed if it was going to take so many days in order to get there. So, yeah, those moments in history are really important ones for thinking about, you know, why do we move to this kind of a practice? And then, of course, when the funeral businesses became professionalized, that was another moment at which certain interests became critical to how funerals were done, and gradually there were shifts if you just look in Kingston at what happened, where the Cataraqui Cemetery was brought into being in the 1890s. You can see there the historical currents that led to that particular kind of garden cemetery, which was a new idea at the time, which was how Cataraqui took over from what we now think of as Skeleton Park, that used to be the upper burial ground here in Kingston. So yeah, the history of the thing is fascinating and really important. Thank you for bringing it up. Are there questions, queries, objections? Or experiences?
oh, Ian's going to ask you something.
I have a question about the process called aquamation, because some have claimed that that's a greener way than cremation, because there's no fire involved. And there was one funeral home in Kingston that was doing aquamation for a while, but
Yeah.
I don't think they.
Have they stopped?
Well, I read in the first year they were temporarily halted from doing that, but I haven't heard any news since. So maybe no news is good news. But
No, I think it's available if you would like aquamation. My understanding is then you soak the body in a lye solution, and that, if you okay, otherwise close your ears, and that dissolves all of the body flesh, and then my question is, where does all that water go? But anyway, never mind. It goes into the sewer system, I think. And then the bones are left, but they're very soft, and then they're ground up, and then you do get some ashes from the bones that
Or
then...
remains.
that are left there. And so, yes, it might be better than cremation.
Yeah.
But, you know, that is personal choice. And we're trying to be amenable to saying, you make your choices, these are the choices available. And our whole advocacy group has been saying to the City of Kingston, people should have a choice. Yeah. So we're not, you know, but I don't know, I'm not going for acclamation, but.
But in terms of simplicity, it does seem to me, anyway, that simple burial in the earth is the most straightforward way of handling it. I don't know why, what was his name? The South African Archbishop.
Desmond Tutu.
Yeah, Desmond Tutu, exactly. He chose acclamation, and that's how it came to some people's ears when they knew that he had done that. And yeah, we didn't know an awful lot about it ourselves until that time. But it, you know, people can make their own choices, obviously, but it does seem to me that simplicity and straightforwardness is very much on the side of a simple earth burial.
And I think also you're bypassing, it's possible that you're bypassing some of that grieving process as well, because I have a friend who chose cremation for his wife, and I know he was sitting with her until she died in the middle of the night. Then the funeral director came, took her out of her apartment, took her to the funeral home. He went there and said he wanted cremation, and everything was planned. He thought it was too expensive to bother renting the chapel to have anything before the cremation, and so he didn't do that. So basically, he left his wife at the funeral home, and I don't know how long it takes. A couple of weeks later, he got a little box of ashes. So there was no good grieving process for that. You know what I mean? Like, I think it does help if we are involved. And also, as Christians, we would think of having some kind of service or something. Whereas today, you talk to people, they say, oh, I don't want any fuss when I die. Just throw me in the garbage, I've had somebody say to me.
Yeah, I hear that a lot.
Yeah, and so, you know.
It's difficult for me as a pastor because often they come to me at the time of death. But often they've already made up their mind for cremation. And if they had asked me, I would have suggested, I think there are better ways to do this. But they didn't ask me.
No.
And at the moment, it's like it's almost too late for me to intervene and say, well, I really think you should. No, at the time of death, we can't.
No.
We find that very hard to do as pastors.
I agree.
For them, because it means shifting gears and rethinking a whole lot of things. I think frequently what you said about simplicity, what is simplest for the person whose loved one has just died is if they have thought about it ahead of time and talked with funeral homes, the option of cremation was, and what appealed to them immediately was that it was way cheaper than the other options.
Yeah.
And so they go to that right away. And by the time I get there to talk with them, it's too late for me to undo that. So that's a dilemma that I have.
You can undo it, by the way, if you've already chosen cremation and you want to change it. You're quite entitled to do so.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah.
That's,
And Ian, what you're saying just underlines again, underscores the importance of talking about death.
Yes.
And using the word death. You know, we go with euphemisms. How many euphemisms do we use for birth? Yeah. Birth is it. Yeah. Why don't we talk about death? Yeah. Because it's going to happen to every single one of us. Yeah. We might as well talk about it while we're alive and share our hopes and our desires and our preferences and all those sorts of things long before. Of course, that's another part of the grieving process, to be ready, having talked about the fact that we are going to die. And
tremendously important.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a few weeks ago, before I was giving another talk somewhere else, and I made that little poem, only because I'd called the session that I was going to lead, I'd called it Over My Dead Body, and then I thought, why did I call it that? And so I wrote it down to say, well, this is what I could think. You know, from that, as I say, I sent it to our kids and grandchildren, so they got what we want. And it was lovely. I got some interesting responses back from them because we've already talked about it anyway, but it was just a reminder to them, yeah, I've got to bear in mind that Poppy D is going to be leaving us at some point. So I think we really do need to change the culture, as we said in an earlier slide here. And if Christians can't contribute to that, then who can?
Thank you.
One last question that came to my mind just today, because I preached a sermon on green belts this morning, is would the definition of green burial, such as you've given us today, do you think that would qualify that space to be considered as green belt?
Yeah, it
under
cannot be built
legislation?
on, it stays,
Whereas
a cemetery.
Cemeteries the way they are today, with formaldehyde in the ground, how can that qualify as green belt area?
Yeah.
But I don't know what the laws say, and I read that in preparation for this sermon, I read Ottawa's green belt has no legislation protecting it from developers.
Yeah.
And so if someone wants to move in and start building houses on it, there's no legal protection for it. It's just the goodwill of the people that keeps it that.
But cemeteries cannot be built on. They're protected. And even when they've gone into disrepair, like the one at Milton, it still stays as a cemetery. So, that land is protected. So that's another thing we're doing, is protecting the land. Do you have a question?
As I understand it, a lot of cemeteries have consecrated ground. So in a larger cemetery, there'll be Anglican or United or Presbyterian, so that ground is consecrated by, I presume, their denomination. What happens with a green burial? Would the individual plot, could that be consecrated?
Well, it depends what is that process of consecrating it, and if you wanted the ground that you were in to be consecrated, you would get the appropriate person to come and do it, and they could do it ahead of time at the funeral, or before the funeral, or yes, I don't really know the details of how it gets consecrated, but I'm sure it could be, if that's what was important to you.
There's also the legal notion of land that has been consecrated. I mean, Skeleton Park again was the ground of great dispute in the early part of the 19th century, well, around 1825 to 1827, there was a lot of dispute over who had the right to bury, who had the right to be buried there, and who had the right to be the person who oversees the burial rites and who says the final prayer of interment and so on. There was a huge battle, and Archdeacon George Oakhill Stewart, who gave his name to 5 of the streets around here, was the center of that particular battle, because he believed that the Anglicans should, well, the United Church of England and Ireland, as it was then, should have control over all the burials that occur in that upper burial ground.
But it had different sections, didn't it? So it had the Presbyterians and the Anglicans and the Catholics, and then it had a pauper's grave section.
But the separate parts of that burial ground were a compromise that came out of the eventual giving way of George Oakhill Stewart to allowing the other denominations. St. Andrews, most obviously, but it was, yeah, that was divided in three, often called Scottish, English, and Irish, but meaning Catholic, Presbyterian, and Anglican in contemporary parlance. So yeah, that whole business was heavily disputed in the 1820s. But yeah, like Sue, I don't know what exactly are the laws around consecrated ground these days, because, you know, large cemeteries like Glenhaven and Cataraqui Cemetery are open to anyone.
Right.
And
Well, they
so-
do have a Muslim section at Glenhaven.
And that's it, and they have a Jewish section.
Section at
Oh, yeah,
Cataraqui.
at Cataraqui.
Yeah.
Another question I have, sorry, is with regard to markers. So I've heard that sometimes there can be like a wooden marker on a metal post or something, or it can be a stone that's carved. And for me personally, wherever I end up, I would like there to be some sort of marker with my full date of birth and my full date of death, so that anybody who wanted to do a family genealogy could find me and be able to do that. And when I went to England in 1970 with my mom, I went and visited a number of cemeteries where my ancestors were. And that proved to be, I took photographs of the headstones, and it proved to be very useful to me because at one of my jobs in the federal government required I had to do my family tree, even going back to my grandparents and their parents. So I was able to take that information from my photographs and trace my family history down to apply for a job. I mean, I know that doesn't happen to a whole lot of people, but I had received top secret security clearance, and so it was very important at that time.
Yeah. Well, yes, and as we're saying, there will be something quite clearly in the cemetery. So whether it will be that you were buried exactly here, not here, that you know, if you look at the map as well, it will, because there'll be a number, and there'll also be a little, probably a little post in the ground that has a number on it. But your full name and date of birth and date of death will be on the notice board or somewhere quite clearly, so you would know, because it's still going to have to be that way to trace. Okay? Are we done? No? And also, if you have more questions, we will go into the refreshment room and you can ask us any other things if you like. But go ahead, Sue.
Just a couple little ones. So speaking of the notice board, would you be able to make your own? Is that a possibility?
What kind of notice board?
Well, the one that has your name and date of birth and whatnot. Not make your own, but have your family member make one if they wanted to do a custom-made wooden one or something. Would that be a possibility?
If it was, well, it depends what the cemetery bylaws allow.
Right.
And so it could be a local stone. It could be, if it was wood, I mean, it is going to biodegrade over time if it's on the ground, isn't it? Or even if it's hanging in a tree, which we've seen. But at Glenwood in Picton, they have a big stone, and then you can choose to have a little metal butterfly with your name and date, and that is on the stone. So, you know, there are all sorts of ways, and in a woodland setting, you know, perhaps there's more possibilities of hanging something in a tree, or, yeah. So it's not impossible, it just depends on what the cemetery rules are.
Right, okay. So if one of us wanted to plan a green burial and we wanted to pass on that information to our family, can you walk me through how that would happen to let them know exactly what we want that would be different than a typical burial or a cremation?
I don't know, Mary-Ann, do you put that in your will? Oh, the exact details of what you want, where would you put that?
You just leave that with your family. I mean,
Yeah.
you can say that I have made prearrangements. It's always good to tuck some statement in your last will so that when people read it, they you know, don't
But in terms of organizing that, like how would my children know what to do about organizing a green burial for me?
You would tell them what you want and where, and if you'd bought a plot, then you would tell them where it would be noted where it was.
Okay.
Okay, and if you want one in the Pine Grove one, then you call Derek Oche, you tell him you do, and then you wait till he calls you and tells you that it's available for sale.
But everyone running a green burial cemetery or section of a cemetery is aware that people are concerned about the details of the memorialization. And we too think it's really important. In some of the ones that we visited in the UK, they had allowed a fair, they were pretty lax about what sort of memorial there was. And frankly, we found it aesthetically disturbing because there were some large things, there were some smaller things. It was a bit of a jumble in one of them that we thought, goodness, if and when we actually get into Pine Grove, we want to have a bit more, not standardization so much as limits to what sorts of things happen. So it has to be something that's decided in a corporate fashion, and you know, we're hoping that if Pine Grove does work out in the way that we hope it will, that we'll be able to have some kind of consultation, like with members of Green Burial Kingston, as well as the core group that will be overseeing what happens in the green burial section there. So it has to be a public discussion, but nobody is unaware of the weight that people put on that memorialization, because it is important.
Yeah.
I think it's tricky for us to anticipate how technology may simplify some of this, but if you think back to security clearances for government and what they didn't have about us in the past and what they have now, where they might have had to sort out 2 David Lyons, where now they can separate out exactly who we're talking about. GPS, we don't walk around knowing the GPS of everything, and yet we can see that the system does know how to do that. And so I think in future, the BAO will always know for actual cemeteries where bodies have been buried.
Yeah.
And so it will be a findable dynamic, and then it will be, what does that environment set up in terms of a park-like atmosphere, a restful, peaceful one where families might come, as they have in the past, to remember some loved one. And if it's also a venue for happy as well as sad things, I think that's a bonus. The land being conserved, I think we skip over that, and I just wanted to say, as someone not too caught up on the spiritual aspects of it or the faith traditions per se, that it's still that human responsibility that you started off with to conserve lands. And given historically that cemeteries were sacred to some degree, whether associated with a particular faith or a variety of ones, it meant that the government wouldn't develop it. And so the more we can make cemeteries, lands that wouldn't have become cemeteries, into cemeteries, we're conserving land. So aquamation would be attractive if it was the greenest and we just didn't have other alternatives. But in a sense, this is a way of doing double duty, because we're putting our body to rest in a way that doesn't despoil the environment, and in fact, it tends to protect it into the long-term future, so that animals, the soil being enriched, well, we're not going to plant a crop on it, but we are going to hope that animal life and flora and fauna, return. So, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Megan.
Okay, so I think we'll wrap up our Q&A in here. But again, we'll have refreshments in the parish hall, so feel free to continue the conversation. And I'm sure this conversation will continue outside of just today as well. I know I've learned a lot today, so I'm going to want to talk about this with people I know and people in my life for sure. So again, thank you for joining us today here at St. James. Thank you to everyone online who has joined us today. And I want to give a huge thank you again to David and Sue. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So yeah, we have refreshments and also those resources, that nice visual comparing the traditional burial versus the natural burial. We have that in the parish hall as well. So.
And some cards that you can take away that tell you about Green Burial and Green Burial Kingston. They're out in the parish hall.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.